Imagine standing at the edge of a place you've never been before. Your boots press into gravel, wind moves through sparse brush. The sun angles across rock formations in a way that feels ordinary, utterly, completely ordinary. You take photographs, you write notes, you mark coordinates on a map, and then you leave. 3 days later, someone asks you what you saw there. You open your mouth to answer. Nothing comes, not amnesia, not confusion, just absence. The memory exists as a shape without detail, a space in your mind that acknowledges something happened, but refuses to render the specifics. Like trying to remember a dream 5 minutes after waking. The harder you grasp for it, the faster it dissolves. This isn't fiction. This is the documented experience of multiple surveying teams, researchers, and independent explorers who entered a specific geographic location over the course of 14 years. A valley that appears on every official map, a place with coordinates, elevation data, and satellite confirmation of its existence. Yet, it remains functionally invisible to human memory. What you're about to hear is the compiled account of those expeditions, the geological data, the neurological studies, the unexplained readings that defied conventional explanation, and the troubling hypothesis that emerged from the evidence that something in that valley doesn't want to be remembered, not through violence or intimidation, but through something far more sophisticated, something that operates at the intersection of physics and consciousness itself. This is the story of the valley that couldn't be remembered, and the question it forces us to confront: what if alien intelligence doesn't hide from our eyes but from our ability to retain what we've seen? Chapter 1. The Cartographer's Assignment. The first official notice came through routine channels. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that suggested what would follow. In the spring of 2008, the United States Geological Survey issued a standard mapping directive to a regional team based in Nevada. The assignment was straightforward: conduct a comprehensive geological survey of a remote valley system in the northeastern corner of the state, approximately 60 miles from any established township. The area had been previously mapped in the 1970s, but recent satellite imaging had detected unusual spectral signatures in the valley basin, reflections that didn't match known mineral compositions, energy patterns that warranted ground-level investigation. The lead surveyor was a man named Michael Reeves, 42 years old, 15 years of field experience, graduate degrees in geology and cartography. By every measure, he was the right person for the assignment. He'd mapped remote terrain across 3 continents. He understood how to read landscape, how to identify geological formations, how to document findings with precision and clarity. The valley appeared unremarkable in the briefing materials. Satellite imagery showed a shallow basin approximately 9 miles long and 4 miles wide, bordered by low ridgelines composed primarily of limestone and basalt. No structures, no roads, no evidence of human activity beyond a few scattered survey markers from decades prior. Vegetation was sparse, consistent with high desert ecology. Seasonal water sources indicated by thin drainage patterns cutting through the valley floor. The unusual energy signatures were the only point of interest. Spectral analysis suggested possible rare earth mineral deposits, concentrations of materials that could have commercial value or scientific significance. The kind of finding that might justify further exploration or restricted access designations. Reeves assembled a team of 4, 2 junior geologists, 1 technical specialist for equipment calibration, and a field photographer to document visual findings. Standard protocol. They would enter the valley, establish a base camp, conduct systematic sampling across a grid pattern, and produce a comprehensive report within 3 weeks. The expedition was scheduled to begin in early June, when weather conditions would be optimal and daylight hours maximised. None of them anticipated what would happen when they crossed into the valley perimeter. None of them could have anticipated it, because nothing in their training, their experience, or their understanding of the natural world prepared them for a place that existed perfectly in space, but refused to exist in memory. Chapter 2. The First Expedition. They entered the valley on June 9th, 2008, at approximately 7:30 in the morning. The access point was a degraded fire road that traced the western ridgeline before descending into the basin. Reeves drove the lead vehicle, a modified all-terrain truck equipped with navigation systems, sample containers, and ground-penetrating radar equipment. The second vehicle followed at a quarter-mile distance, standard procedure for terrain evaluation. Radio communication remained clear throughout the descent. Weather conditions were favourable. Visibility exceeded 10 miles. Nothing suggested complications. Reeves later described the initial impression as aggressively normal. The valley floor appeared exactly as satellite imaging had indicated. Rocky substrate with scattered desert scrub, minimal topographic variation, a dry stream bed cutting northwest to southeast, evidence of seasonal water flow, but currently inactive. The kind of landscape that defines much of the Great Basin region, geologically stable, visually unremarkable. They established base camp on a relatively flat expanse near the valley's centre. Tents erected, equipment unpacked and calibrated. Initial GPS readings confirmed their position, matched the planned coordinates, all systems functioning within normal parameters. The team began systematic exploration, grid pattern survey, marking locations for soil and rock sampling. The photographer documented landscape features, geological formations, and team activities. Standard field protocol. Everything proceeded exactly as planned. And that's where the account becomes difficult to reconstruct. Because when Reeves and his team returned to base camp that first evening, something had already begun to happen. Something none of them recognised in the moment, because it operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. They prepared dinner. They reviewed the day's route on GPS displays. They discussed findings in general terms. Rock compositions appeared consistent with preliminary analysis. No obvious concentrations of rare earth minerals detected yet. Tomorrow, they would expand the search radius. But when Reeves opened his field notebook to log specific observations, he found himself staring at blank spaces between time-stamped entries. He remembered stopping to examine an outcropping around 11:15. He remembered the act of writing, but the page contained only the timestamp and location coordinates. No description, no analysis, just empty lines where observation should have been. He assumed fatigue. Perhaps he'd intended to fill in details later and forgotten. It happened sometimes in fieldwork, long days, mental exhaustion. He made a note to be more thorough tomorrow. The photographer reviewed the day's images on a laptop. Hundreds of photographs, landscape shots, close-ups of rock formations, team members collecting samples, all technically sound, proper exposure, good composition. But when asked to describe specific locations depicted in the images, he found himself struggling. The photographs existed, the landscapes in them existed, but the memory of standing in those specific places, of framing those specific shots, felt distant, accessible intellectually, but not viscerally. Again, fatigue seemed the likely explanation. The team turned in early, planning to resume work at dawn. That night, several team members reported unusual dreams. Not nightmares, not disturbing in content, just strange. Dreams of walking through identical landscapes, of covering the same ground repeatedly without realizing it, of turning in circles while believing they were moving in straight lines. Upon waking, the dreams faded quickly, leaving only a vague sense of disorientation. The second day followed the same pattern: exploration, documentation, sample collection, all proceeding normally, all producing results, but the gap between activity and recollection continued to widen. By the third day, the team began to notice, began to discuss it openly. Something was wrong with their documentation. GPS logs showed extensive ground coverage. Photographs confirmed they'd visited dozens of distinct locations. But when comparing field notes, they found inconsistencies, descriptions that didn't match, landmarks recalled differently by different team members, as if each person had explored a slightly different version of the valley. Reeves made the decision to cut the expedition short, not out of fear, but out of recognition that their data was becoming unreliable. Whatever they were documenting couldn't be trusted. They needed to return to base, review what they had, and determine whether equipment malfunction or some environmental factor was compromising their observations. They packed up on the morning of June 13th, 4 days in the valley, hundreds of samples collected, thousands of photographs taken, gigabytes of GPS data logged, and almost no one could clearly describe what they'd seen. Chapter 3. The missing field notes. The return to the regional USGS office should have been routine. Debrief, data upload, sample processing, initial analysis followed by a preliminary report while memories were still fresh. But memories weren't fresh. That became immediately apparent during the debriefing session. Reeves sat across from the regional director, a woman named Patricia Holbrook, who'd overseen dozens of similar expeditions. She asked standard questions. Describe the terrain. Identify notable geological features. Explain any deviations from the planned survey route. Reeves found himself answering in generalities. The valley was rocky, relatively flat, consistent with satellite imaging. When pressed for specifics, he referenced his field notes, but the field notes contained fragments, timestamps without context, coordinates without descriptions, entire pages where he'd clearly intended to write detailed observations but had somehow never completed the entries. The pattern repeated across all 4 team members. Everyone remembered being in the valley. Everyone remembered the work, but the specifics dissolved under examination. Like trying to describe the plot of a movie you'd watched while distracted by something else. The outline existed, but the details refused to cohere. Holbrook initially suspected contamination, environmental exposure to some neurotoxic substance that had impaired cognitive function without producing other symptoms. She ordered medical evaluations for the entire team: blood work, neurological assessments, testing for heavy metals, organic compounds, anything that might explain the memory disruption. All results came back normal. No toxins detected, no neurological abnormalities. Brain function within expected parameters. Physically, the team was completely healthy. The photographs told a different story, or rather, they told a story the team couldn't remember experiencing. The field photographer, whose name was David Chen, had taken 2,347 photographs over 4 days. Professional quality images, properly exposed, well composed. They depicted a landscape that matched the general description: desert valley, rock formations, sparse vegetation. But certain details in the photographs confused the team. Chen had photographed what appeared to be a series of unusual rock outcroppings in the southeastern quadrant of the valley, geometric formations, too regular to seem entirely natural. Yet no one on the team remembered discussing them. No one remembered Chen specifically positioning himself to photograph them. The images existed, the formations existed, but the memory of the experience had somehow failed to encode. More troubling were the GPS tracks. The team had covered far more ground than anyone remembered. The logged routes showed systematic grid coverage, exactly as planned, but substantial portions of those routes existed only as data points. No one could recall walking them. No landmarks from those sections registered in memory. Just blank spaces where experience should have been. Holbrook made copies of everything. The photographs, the GPS data, the incomplete field notes. She filed an incident report with the USGS regional office, flagging the expedition as producing unreliable data. Normally that would have ended the matter. The valley would have been rescheduled for resurvey, perhaps with different team members or modified protocols. But something about the pattern bothered her, the consistency of the memory disruption across all team members, the way it affected recollection without producing any other symptoms, the selective nature of what could and couldn't be remembered. She began reviewing historical survey records for the area, looking for any previous documentation of the valley, any indication that earlier teams had experienced similar issues. What she found was absence, not in the sense of missing files, but in the sense of incomplete ones. The 1974 survey showed similar characteristics: coordinates logged, samples collected, but the written reports were oddly sparse, describing the valley in broad strokes without specific detail, as if the surveyors had struggled to articulate what they'd observed. Going back further, she found a 1953 geological assessment. Same pattern, general descriptions, vague conclusions, an overall sense that the documentation had been produced by someone trying to remember something they had already forgotten. Holbrook made a decision that would prove consequential. She didn't close the file. Instead, she flagged it for further investigation, and she began making inquiries, reaching out to colleagues, asking if anyone had heard of similar phenomena, landscapes that seemed to resist documentation, places that existed geographically but not mnemonically. The responses she received suggested this was not an isolated case. Chapter 4. The Memory Drift. Over the following months, something strange happened to the expedition team. Their memories of the valley began to diverge. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, like photographs developing in different chemical baths. Each team member's recollection of the landscape began to differ from the others in increasingly irreconcilable ways. Reeves remembered the valley as predominantly flat, a basin with minimal elevation change, bordered by low ridges but otherwise featureless. When he tried to visualize it, that's what came to mind. Flat, empty, unremarkable. One of the junior geologists, a woman named Sarah Kim, remembered it differently. In her recollection, the valley contained significant topographic variation. Not mountains exactly, but substantial rises and depressions. She remembered climbing, descending into hollows, navigating around elevated formations. When shown the GPS data indicating mostly level terrain, she expressed confusion. That didn't match her experience. She distinctly remembered the physicality of moving through varied elevation. The other junior geologist recalled water features, not the dry stream bed documented in photographs, but active springs, small pools, moisture that created localized patches of denser vegetation. He remembered stopping to collect water samples, though no such samples appeared in the expedition's logged materials. Chen, the photographer, remembered light, specifically unusual light, the way sun reflected off rock surfaces at angles that seemed wrong for the time of day, shadows that extended in directions inconsistent with the sun's position. He remembered compensating for it while framing shots, adjusting exposure to account for light that shouldn't have been there. But the photographs showed normal illumination, standard desert daylight, nothing anomalous. These weren't arguments or disagreements. Each person accepted that their memory might be faulty, but they also couldn't shake the visceral certainty of their own recollections. Kim genuinely remembered climbing. The geologist genuinely remembered water. Chen genuinely remembered strange light. The experiences felt real in a way that contradicted the documented evidence. Holbrook documented these divergences carefully. She conducted individual interviews, asking each team member to describe the valley without reference to photographs or GPS data, pure recollection. What she found was 4 fundamentally incompatible descriptions of the same location. Not minor variations in detail, but substantive differences in the basic character of the landscape itself. This was more than memory failure. Memory failure produces absence, gaps, uncertainty. This was memory substitution. Each person's mind had filled the gaps with something, but what it had filled them with was different for each individual. As if the valley existed in a state of perceptual flux, presenting slightly different versions of itself to different observers. Or as if whatever was interfering with memory formation wasn't simply erasing experience, but replacing it with false constructs, placeholder memories designed to occupy cognitive space without providing actual information. Holbrook shared her findings with Dr. Elizabeth Grant, a neuropsychologist who specialized in memory formation and environmental cognitive effects. Grant reviewed the interview transcripts, the photographs, and the GPS data. Her conclusion was both fascinating and troubling. The pattern was consistent with what neuroscience calls source confusion. The brain correctly remembers that an experience occurred, but incorrectly assigns details to that experience drawn from other memories, expectations, or environmental cues. It's common in eyewitness testimony. People remember seeing something, but what they remember seeing is actually a reconstruction combining actual perception with assumed details. But source confusion typically operates on small scales, misremembering the colour of a car, confusing which person said what during a conversation. What Holbrook's team experienced was source confusion at landscape scale, misremembering the fundamental topography of a 9-mile valley. That shouldn't be possible through normal cognitive mechanisms. Grant proposed a hypothesis. Something in the valley environment was interfering with memory consolidation, the process by which short-term sensory experience converts into long-term memory. If that process was disrupted during the expedition, the brain would try to fill the resulting gaps with plausible constructs. Each person's brain would fill them differently, based on individual expectations and prior experiences. But what could disrupt memory consolidation so precisely without producing other neurological symptoms, without causing headaches, disorientation, or cognitive impairment during the actual experience? Grant didn't have an answer, neither did Holbrook, but they agreed on the next step. They needed to go back, to enter the valley again, this time with neurological monitoring equipment, real-time measurement of brain activity during exposure. Perhaps that would reveal what conventional medical testing had missed. The second expedition was approved in October of 2008. Smaller team, more specialised equipment, and one critical addition: continuous video documentation. Not just of the landscape, but of the team members themselves, recording their real-time descriptions and reactions, creating an external memory that couldn't be altered by whatever force was operating in the valley. Chapter 5: The Aerial Survey Attempt. Before committing personnel to a second ground expedition, Holbrook authorised an aerial survey, unmanned drones equipped with high-resolution cameras and multispectral sensors. The goal was to map the valley in detail from above, creating a comprehensive visual and electromagnetic profile without human observers present. If the memory disruption effect was limited to ground-level exposure, aerial documentation might provide uncontaminated baseline data. 3 drones were deployed on October 21, 2008, launched from the western ridge above the valley, pre-programmed flight paths designed to provide complete coverage at multiple altitudes. Each drone carried redundant recording systems, everything transmitted in real time to a monitoring station positioned 5 miles outside the valley perimeter. The first drone entered valley airspace at approximately 900 feet above valley floor level. Video feed remained clear and stable. The operators watched as the drone followed its programmed route, cameras capturing detailed imagery of the terrain below. Everything appeared normal. Standard aerial survey. No anomalies detected. Then, at timestamp 14 minutes, 37 seconds, the video feed flickered. Not a signal interruption. Not interference or data corruption. The image itself flickered, as if the landscape being recorded had momentarily become uncertain. Edges of rock formations blurred, shadows shifted position without corresponding movement of the sun. The valley floor appeared to ripple, though meteorological data confirmed no wind activity at surface level. The flicker lasted less than 2 seconds, then the feed stabilised. The landscape resumed its normal appearance, but the operators had seen it. Frame-by-frame analysis would later confirm it. For a brief moment, the valley had appeared to reorganise itself. Subtle shifts in the positioning of geological features. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would be noticeable in a single frame, but visible in the transition. Like watching a stage set being rotated between scenes. The second drone experienced similar effects. Intermittent visual distortions. Terrain features that seemed to occupy slightly different positions from one recording pass to the next. Again, nothing blatant. Nothing that defied explanation outright, but troubling in its consistency. The third drone encountered more significant difficulties. At approximately 23 minutes into its flight path, its altimeter began reporting inconsistent readings. The drone's onboard systems indicated it was maintaining a steady 900 feet above ground level, but the transmitted video showed the distance to the valley floor fluctuating, closer, then farther, then closer again, as if the ground itself was rising and falling in slow waves, despite the drone maintaining constant altitude. The operators attempted manual override, directing the drone to climb to 1,200 feet to create additional safety margin. The drone responded to the command. Altitude increased to 1,200 feet, according to onboard telemetry, but the video feed showed no corresponding change in perspective. The valley floor remained at the same apparent distance. At 29 minutes, 42 seconds, the third drone's GPS system failed. Not gradually, not through progressive signal degradation. It simply stopped receiving satellite positioning data, as if the drone had ceased to exist in a location that GPS satellites could identify. The operators immediately commanded the drone to return to its launch point using inertial navigation. The drone complied, following pre-programmed emergency return protocols, but the route it flew didn't match the route it had taken inward. GPS tracking from the monitoring station showed the drone following a curved path that should have been straight, compensating for drift that its own systems weren't detecting. The drone exited Valley airspace after 41 minutes of total flight time. GPS function restored immediately upon crossing the perimeter. All systems returned to normal operation, but the flight data told a troubling story. According to the drone's internal logs, it had flown a total of 37.2 miles during the survey. According to GPS tracking from the monitoring station, it had flown 49.8 miles, a discrepancy of more than 12 miles. The drone systems believed it had flown one route. External tracking indicated it had actually flown something considerably more complex. Analysis of the video and sensor data produced additional concerns. Electromagnetic readings fluctuated throughout the flight, not randomly, but in patterns. Low-frequency pulses emanating from the valley floor, too regular to be natural background radiation, too subtle to be industrial equipment, and originating from locations deep beneath the surface, below the bedrock layer, depths that conventional geology suggested shouldn't contain anything capable of generating electromagnetic activity. The spectral analysis detected anomalies in surface rock composition, crystalline structures that shouldn't exist in that geological context, formations that appeared to have grown rather than been deposited, and characteristics suggesting piezoelectric properties, materials that generate electrical charge when subjected to mechanical stress, or when influenced by external electromagnetic fields. Holbrook reviewed the aerial survey data with growing concern. The valley wasn't just difficult to remember, it was actively unstable, or appeared unstable, or made observation equipment behave as if it were unstable. The distinction mattered from a scientific perspective, but the practical result was the same. Something in that valley was interfering with the normal relationship between observation and reality. The question was whether to proceed with the planned ground expedition. Sending people into an environment that had caused drones to malfunction and GPS systems to fail seemed irresponsible, but cancelling the expedition meant leaving fundamental questions unanswered. And Holbrook suspected that whatever was happening in the valley might not affect mechanical systems and human cognition in the same way. The aerial survey had captured valuable data precisely because drones don't form memories. They record sensory input without interpretation, without expectation, without the cognitive frameworks that human memory relies on. If the valley's effect was targeted specifically at consciousness, at the subjective experience of observation, then automated systems might perceive it differently than human minds. After extensive consultation and safety protocol development, Holbrook authorised the second ground expedition, but with strict parameters, continuous external monitoring, scheduled check-ins every 2 hours, and an agreement that the team would withdraw immediately if they experienced any of the memory disruption effects documented in the first expedition. What happened during that second expedition would transform this from a geological curiosity into something far more significant. something that suggested intelligence behind the interference, purpose behind the concealment. Chapter 6. The Geological Anomaly. The second ground team entered the valley on November 3rd, 2008. 3 people this time. Holbrook herself, Dr. Elizabeth Grant, the neuropsychologist, and a geophysics specialist named Robert Torres. Minimal personnel, maximum instrumentation. Every team member wore medical monitoring equipment. Heart rate, blood pressure, electroencephalography sensors measuring brainwave activity. Everything transmitted continuously to the external monitoring station. They also carried something unusual, a handheld ground-penetrating radar unit, portable technology that had only recently become field practical. It could image subsurface structures to depths of 50 feet or more, depending on soil composition. Torres wanted to investigate the source of the electromagnetic pulses detected during the aerial survey, see if there was something beneath the valley floor that conventional surface observation had missed. The entry proceeded without incident. The team established a minimal camp near the coordinates of the first expedition's base, all systems functioning normally. Monitoring station confirmed clear telemetry, brainwave patterns for all 3 team members within expected parameters. Grant immediately noticed the effect Reeves had described, the sense of aggressive normality. The landscape demanded no particular attention, generated no emotional response. It simply existed unremarkably in a way that made detailed observation feel unnecessary. She recognized this as significant. Her professional expertise was in attention and memory, and she understood that memory formation requires attention. If the environment was somehow suppressing the instinct to attend carefully, that alone could explain memory consolidation failure. But there was something more, something she couldn't quite articulate, a quality to the sensory experience that felt thin, as if she were observing the valley through a filter, not visually. Vision was perfectly clear, but experientially. The weight of being in a place, the accumulated micro-sensations that create the feeling of presence, those felt muted, distant. Holbrook documented observations continuously into a handheld recorder, speaking her perceptions aloud as they occurred, creating a real-time verbal record that could be compared against later recollection. She described the terrain, the light quality, the specific rock formations visible from the camp location, forcing herself to attend to details, to engage the cognitive processes that would normally encode experience into memory. Torres began the subsurface survey, moving in a systematic grid pattern, scanning beneath the surface, building a composite image of what lay below the visible landscape. The initial readings matched expectations: sediment layers, bedrock at varying depths, the usual geological structure of an ancient basin. Then, approximately 200 yards from camp, the ground-penetrating radar detected something unusual. At a depth of 38 feet, the scan revealed a layer of material with density characteristics that didn't match surrounding geology. Not denser exactly, different. The radar return signal showed a pattern Torres had never seen in natural formations. Highly organized, almost crystalline, but extending across an area far too large to be a natural crystal formation. He marked the location and continued scanning. 50 yards farther, the same anomalous layer appeared, same depth, same unusual density characteristics. He adjusted his search pattern, deliberately seeking the extent of the formation. Over the next 3 hours, he mapped it. An underground layer, roughly circular, approximately half a mile in diameter. Buried deep enough to be invisible to surface observation, but there, definitely there, and definitely not natural geology. Grant, meanwhile, was conducting a different kind of investigation. She'd brought a portable EEG unit capable of more detailed brain monitoring than the basic telemetry being transmitted to the monitoring station. She wanted to see if being in the valley produced any measurable change in neural activity, anything that might explain the memory effects. She ran baseline tests on all 3 team members, standard cognitive tasks, memory encoding exercises, pattern recognition, everything within normal ranges, no indication of impairment, no suggestion that their brains were functioning differently than they would anywhere else. But when she analysed the continuous EEG data, she found something subtle, a low-frequency oscillation in the background activity of all 3 brains. Not pathological, not indicative of any medical condition, but present. A rhythm that wasn't there in the baseline data collected before entering the valley. Approximately 8 Hz, right at the lower edge of the alpha wave range. The frequency associated with wakeful relaxation, the state between alert consciousness and drowsiness. What was interesting was the synchronization. All 3 team members showed the same oscillation pattern. Despite being engaged in different tasks, attending to different stimuli, their background brain activity had entrained to the same rhythm. That shouldn't happen. Individual brains generate their own patterns based on individual activity and cognition. Finding 3 people spontaneously synchronized suggested an external influence, something in the environment affecting neural function at a level below conscious awareness. Grant shared her findings with Holbrook and Torres. They discussed implications. The synchronization wasn't harmful in itself. 8 Hz alpha waves were normal and healthy, but the fact that an external stimulus could induce synchronized brain activity across multiple people suggested a mechanism for the memory effects. If something in the valley could influence brainwave patterns, it might be able to influence memory consolidation processes as well. Torres proposed a hypothesis. What if the electromagnetic pulses detected during the aerial survey were the source? Low-frequency electromagnetic fields can affect brain activity. It's well documented in scientific literature. Electromagnetic interference with neural function. If the buried formation was generating precisely tuned pulses, it could theoretically influence brain states in people on the surface above it. But that raised an obvious question. Why would a natural geological formation generate electromagnetic pulses tuned to frequencies that affect human cognition? Coincidence seemed unlikely, which meant considering less comfortable explanations. They decided to collect samples. Torres used a portable auger drill to extract core samples from above the anomalous layer. Drilling down through 40 feet of sediment and rock, the process took hours. The equipment operated normally. No unusual resistance, no indication that the subsurface material was anything other than standard geology, until the drill bit reached 39 feet. At that depth, it encountered the anomalous layer, and the sensation changed. The drill bit still advanced, still removed material, but the vibration pattern changed. The sound changed. Torres, who'd operated drilling equipment for 15 years, immediately recognized something was different. The material being drilled wasn't behaving like rock. It wasn't behaving like any geological substance he'd encountered. It was almost responsive, as if it recognized being penetrated and was adjusting its structure in reaction. When he extracted the drill bit, the core sample it contained looked unremarkable. Grey-brown mineral composite, consistent with sedimentary rock. But when Torres examined it more closely, he found structures that shouldn't exist. Crystalline lattices, far too regular to be natural formations, oriented in specific directions, and exhibiting properties he couldn't immediately explain. When he held a magnet near the sample, the crystals shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly without close observation, but they moved, reorienting themselves in response to the magnetic field. Grant observed the sample exhibiting piezoelectric response. When mechanically stressed, when pressure was applied, the material generated a measurable electrical charge. And when exposed to electrical current, it produced mechanical vibration. The material was transducing energy between forms, converting electromagnetic input into physical movement, and vice versa. They tested further, exposing the sample to electromagnetic fields at different frequencies. The material responded selectively. Certain frequencies produced strong reactions, others none at all. The range that produced the most significant response centered around 8 Hz, the same frequency that had appeared in the synchronized brainwave patterns. The implications were difficult to ignore. The valley contained a buried layer of material that responded to electromagnetic stimulation, that generated electrical effects when mechanically stressed. That was organized in highly structured patterns across an area half a mile in diameter, and that resonated most strongly at frequencies known to affect human brain activity. None of that proved artificial origin. In principle, natural processes could produce such materials. Unlikely, yes, but not impossible. What troubled the team more was the specificity, the precision with which the material's resonance frequency matched cognitively significant brainwave patterns. That level of coincidence strained credibility. As the sun set on their first day in the valley, the team gathered at camp to discuss their findings. The monitoring station confirmed they'd completed 8 hours of continuous exposure. All medical parameters remained normal. No one reported headaches, disorientation, or other symptoms. But Grant's continuous EEG monitoring showed the alpha wave synchronization had intensified. All 3 brains now showing identical patterns, as if they were components of a single system rather than independent consciousnesses. And when Holbrook reviewed the verbal documentation she'd been recording throughout the day, she found the same pattern Reeves had described. Gaps, moments when she'd clearly intended to describe something, but had instead fallen silent. Timestamps with no corresponding observations. Her voice on the recording saying, "I'm going to document the rock formation to the northeast," followed by 30 seconds of ambient noise, then resuming with a different subject entirely, as if her attention had been redirected, as if something had prevented her from completing the observation. They were experiencing the effect in real time, with full instrumentation documenting exactly what their brains were doing while it happened, and none of them could feel it occurring. The interference operated below the threshold of conscious detection, which made it far more sophisticated than simple sensory jamming. This was cognitive manipulation, targeted, precise, and utterly invisible to the people experiencing it. The question that kept them awake that night was simple but profound. Was this natural, or was it designed? Chapter 7. The biological reaction. The team remained in the valley for 3 more days. Each day brought new observations, new data, new questions. The alpha wave synchronization persisted. Grant's continuous monitoring showed that once established, the pattern didn't fluctuate significantly. All 3 team members maintained synchronized 8 Hz background activity, regardless of what they were doing. Sleeping, eating, working, the rhythm underneath their individual cognition remained locked to the same frequency. What became more concerning was the subjective experience, not during the first day, when alertness and novelty kept them engaged, but during days 2 and 3, when the work became routine and the landscape became familiar, they began to notice something unusual about their emotional responses, or rather, their lack of emotional responses. Grant described it as affective flattening, the muting of emotional experience, not depression exactly, not numbness in a pathological sense, but a dampening of the normal variability in mood and reaction. Things that should have been frustrating didn't frustrate. Discoveries that should have been exciting didn't excite. Everything existed in a narrow band of mild interest, never strong, never absent, just muted. Torres noticed it in his work. Normally, fieldwork produced emotional engagement, anticipation when approaching promising survey locations, satisfaction when findings confirmed hypotheses, disappointment when results were inconclusive. But in the valley, those reactions felt distant. He recognized intellectually that certain findings were significant, but the significance didn't resonate emotionally. It was as if the cognitive understanding of importance existed separate from the feeling of importance. Holbrook recognized the danger immediately. Emotional engagement drives decision-making, helps prioritize actions, signals when situations require heightened attention or when they're safe to treat routinely. If the valley was suppressing emotional response, it was also suppressing critical cognitive functions. They might make poor decisions without recognizing them as poor because the emotional warning systems that normally flag bad choices weren't operating. She reviewed the medical monitoring data with concern. Heart rate remained stable, too stable. Normally, heart rate variability increases and decreases in response to physical activity, stress, relaxation. But all 3 team members showed abnormally consistent heart rates, as if their autonomic nervous systems had entered a state of artificial calm, not medically dangerous in the short term, but not normal, not healthy. Blood pressure showed similar patterns, stable to the point of being suspicious. Grant's professional analysis suggested their bodies were experiencing sustained parasympathetic dominance, the nervous system state associated with rest and digest functions, reduced alertness, lowered defensive responses, the opposite of the fight or flight activation that normally accompanies novel or potentially threatening environments. The valley was making them calm, keeping them calm, preventing the normal arousal responses that would make them cautious or concerned, and it was doing so through mechanisms that affected both neural activity and physiological state. The electromagnetic interference with brain function was only part of it. Something else was operating on their biology more broadly. On the 3rd day, they conducted an experiment. They hiked to the valley perimeter, deliberately exiting the area where subsurface scans had detected the anomalous material layer. The moment they crossed the boundary, everything changed. Heart rate variability returned to normal within minutes. The alpha wave synchronization broke. Each team member's EEG pattern diverged, resuming individualized activity. And emotionally, they all reported a sudden return of affective range. Relief at being out of the valley, anxiety about what they'd been experiencing, excitement about the data they'd collected, all the normal emotional responses that had been absent during their time inside. More striking was what happened to their memories. Standing outside the valley, looking back at the landscape they'd just spent 3 days exploring, they struggled to visualize specific locations. Grant could remember conducting EEG tests, but couldn't picture where she'd been standing while doing so. Torres remembered drilling the core samples, but the visual memory of the drilling location felt vague, approximate, like remembering something from years past rather than hours. They returned to camp inside the valley. Within 30 minutes, the effects resumed. Synchronized brainwaves, affective flattening, physiological calm. The transition was rapid and consistent. Cross the boundary outward, effects cease. Cross the boundary inward, effects resume, as precise as flipping a switch. That evening they reviewed all collected data, the subsurface scans, the core samples, the medical monitoring, the subjective reports, and they began formulating conclusions that resisted conventional explanation. The valley contained a buried structure, exhibiting properties inconsistent with natural geology. That structure generated electromagnetic effects tuned to frequencies affecting human cognition. Exposure to those effects produced measurable changes in brain activity, physiological state, and subjective experience, changes that impaired memory formation and emotional engagement, changes that made detailed observation difficult and sustained attention unlikely. If this were a natural phenomenon, it represented an extraordinary confluence of geological accident, material properties, electromagnetic resonance, cognitive effects, all aligning in ways that specifically impaired human observation and memory. Possible in principle, vanishingly unlikely in practice. If this were not natural, then it was designed, built, placed there deliberately, which raised questions far more troubling than geological anomalies. Who would build something like this? When? And most importantly, why? Grant offered a hypothesis that none of them wanted to accept but couldn't dismiss. What if the purpose was exactly what they were experiencing? What if this was defensive architecture? Not defense through violence or physical barrier, defense through cognitive interference. Making a location exist in physical space while preventing it from existing in human awareness. Anyone who visited would leave without retaining meaningful memory of what they'd seen, without emotional investment in returning, without the sustained attention necessary to investigate thoroughly. It was concealment through neurology rather than camouflage. And it was working. Even now, knowing what was happening, understanding the mechanisms, they could feel their motivation to investigate further slowly eroding. The effective flattening made continued research feel unimportant. Why spend more time here when everything seemed mundane? Why pursue questions that didn't generate curiosity? They recognized the manipulation, but recognition didn't prevent it. That was the sophistication of the system. It operated on processes below conscious control. Understanding that your brain waves were being externally synchronized didn't allow you to desynchronize them through willpower. Knowing that your emotional responses were being dampened didn't restore those responses through cognitive effort. On the morning of day 4, Holbrook made the decision to withdraw. Not because they'd completed their investigation, but because continuing posed risks they couldn't adequately assess. The valley was affecting them in ways that impaired judgment. Staying longer might prevent them from recognizing when to leave, might normalize conditions that should alarm them. They had enough data, enough samples, enough documentation to begin serious analysis. What they needed now was distance, perspective, and time to process what they discovered outside the influence zone. They packed up camp, loaded equipment, prepared to exit. And as they did, all three of them experienced the same fleeting thought. Why had they bothered coming here at all? The valley was ordinary, unremarkable, nothing worth the effort of a multi-day expedition. They should have known that from the aerial survey. Should have recognised there was nothing here requiring ground investigation. The thought passed, recognised as artificial, a last echo of the cognitive interference. But it demonstrated how easily the valley could make itself forgettable, how naturally the impulse to dismiss and ignore could arise, how someone without their training and awareness might simply leave, forget, and never think about the place again. They crossed the perimeter at 2:15 in the afternoon. The moment they exited the influence zone, memory of the previous 4 days suddenly felt distant, dreamlike. They could intellectually access what had happened, but the experiential reality of it felt thin, already fading. Grant immediately conducted post-exposure assessments. All three showed residual alpha wave synchronization for approximately 40 minutes after exit. Then normal brain activity resumed. Heart rate variability normalized. Emotional range returned fully within 2 hours. But the memory effects persisted. Days later, back at the research facility, reviewing their own documentation and recordings, they all struggled to viscerally remember being in the valley. The data existed. The samples existed. The medical monitoring confirmed they'd been there. But the subjective experience had already begun to dissolve, as if the valley defended itself, even in memory, making sure that anyone who discovered it would gradually forget the details of their discovery. Chapter 8. The Discovery Beneath the Basin. The core samples underwent extensive analysis over the following months: material composition testing, crystallographic structure mapping, electromagnetic property characterization. What emerged was a picture of something that challenged conventional understanding of geology, materials science, and perhaps reality itself. The crystalline structures in the samples weren't random. They formed a highly organized lattice with specific geometric properties. When examined under electron microscopy, the lattice showed repeating patterns at multiple scales, fractal organization. The same structural motifs appearing at nanometer scales and micrometer scales. This level of hierarchical organization is sometimes seen in biological systems, almost never in geological ones. The material exhibited properties suggesting it was engineered, not grown through natural geological processes, but assembled. The crystalline structures aligned with precision far exceeding what random formation would produce. Error rates in the lattice spacing were less than 0.01%. That kind of uniformity requires controlled construction. Chemical analysis revealed additional anomalies. The material contained trace elements in ratios that didn't match any known geological processes. Not impossible combinations, nothing that violated chemistry, but distributions that suggested deliberate mixture rather than natural deposition. Most significant was the electromagnetic behavior. The material responded to specific frequencies with extraordinary efficiency. When exposed to an 8 Hz electromagnetic pulse, it resonated, amplified the signal, converted it between electrical and magnetic forms, created standing wave patterns that could extend beyond the material itself. Torres worked with electrical engineers to model what a half-mile diameter layer of this material would do if energized. The models suggested it would function as a massive resonance chamber, capable of generating electromagnetic fields extending hundreds of feet above the surface. Fields that would be strongest directly above the layer, weaker near the edges, creating a defined influence zone matching exactly what the team had experienced. Strong effect in the valley centre, diminishing toward the perimeter, precise boundary where effect ceased. But the resonance required an energy source. The material didn't generate electromagnetic fields spontaneously. Something had to power it. The team reviewed subsurface imaging data, looking for evidence of what that might be. Deep penetration radar scans, conducted from multiple positions around the valley over several weeks, revealed something extraordinary. The crystalline layer wasn't the deepest structure. Below it, at depths exceeding 200 feet, the scans detected geometric formations, perfect symmetry, angles and proportions that couldn't be natural. The resolution wasn't sufficient to image fine details, but the large-scale structure was unmistakable. Rectangular chambers, interconnecting passages, organized layout, the geometry of architecture, not geology, and the scale was massive. The formation extended across an area nearly a mile in diameter, far larger than the upper crystalline layer. This was the moment when the investigation transformed from geological curiosity to something else entirely. Because what lay beneath the valley wasn't a natural formation. It was a structure, built by someone, buried intentionally, and still active. The crystalline layer above it was interfacing technology, converting energy from the deeper structure into electromagnetic fields that affected the surface. The whole system was designed. The placement, the materials, the frequencies. Everything was engineered to produce exactly the effect the team had experienced. Cognitive disruption, preventing sustained observation and memory formation. Holbrook assembled a classified briefing. Limited distribution. Department of Defense, NASA, DARPA. The institutions that might have both the expertise and security clearance to handle what was being proposed. She laid out the evidence systematically. The subsurface structure, the engineered materials, the precisely tuned cognitive interference. The conclusion was difficult to avoid. Something had been built beneath the valley. Something still functional. Something designed to hide itself from human observation. The immediate question was age. How long had this been there? Geological surveys suggested the valley surface hadn't changed significantly in thousands of years. The sediment layers above the crystalline structure showed normal deposition patterns, undisturbed accumulation over millennia. Whatever was down there had been buried for at minimum several thousand years, possibly much longer. Dating technology available at the time couldn't provide precise answers. The materials were too unusual, the structure too deep for conventional excavation. What could be said with certainty was that this preceded modern civilization, preceded recorded history, existed before humans in this region had the technological capability to construct anything remotely comparable. Which meant either an unknown advanced civilization had existed in prehistory and left this behind, or the structure wasn't human in origin at all. The second option seemed impossible, but so did the first. No archaeological evidence supported an advanced civilization in North America capable of this level of engineering thousands of years ago. No historical records, no artifacts, no infrastructure. Just this, one inexplicable installation in a remote valley. Unless this wasn't the only one. Unless the memory disruption field had ensured that even if other sites existed, they'd been systematically forgotten, visited repeatedly throughout history, documented inadequately, filed away as unremarkable. the perfect concealment system. Hide in plain sight by preventing sustained attention and memory formation. The investigation team searched historical records, looking for other locations with similar characteristics, places that had been surveyed multiple times but never thoroughly documented, locations that appeared on maps but resisted detailed description, geographic anomalies where different sources reported inconsistent terrain features. They found 17 possible candidates, remote locations across North America, each with thin documentation, each surveyed multiple times over the decades, each described in vague terms, suggesting the surveyors had struggled to articulate what they'd seen. Not proof, but suggestive, enough to warrant investigation. But investigating 17 remote sites with specialized equipment and security precautions wasn't feasible immediately. The project needed resources, authorization, institutional support beyond what a regional USGS office could provide. Holbrook requested federal funding, submitted proposals to multiple agencies, argued for systematic investigation of what might be a network of installations. The responses were mixed. Some agencies expressed interest, others dismissed the findings as misinterpretation of natural phenomena. The project existed in limbo, important enough to maintain minimal funding, not important enough to receive the resources necessary for comprehensive investigation. Meanwhile, the valley remained undisturbed, coordinates on file, samples collected, data documented, but no further expeditions were authorized. Too expensive, too speculative, too far outside conventional research parameters. The place that couldn't be remembered was officially forgotten by institutional science. Until 2015, when satellite technology improved enough to detect something the earlier surveys had missed. Something that suggested the installations weren't just ancient artifacts. They were still operational, still connected to something, still serving their original purpose. Chapter 9. The Memory Shield Hypothesis. Dr. Elizabeth Grant continued her analysis of the cognitive effects even after official funding ceased. The phenomenon fascinated her from a neuroscience perspective. The precision of the interference suggested understanding of human cognition far exceeding current scientific knowledge. Whoever designed the system understood not just that human memory could be disrupted, but exactly how to disrupt it without producing other symptoms. That required detailed knowledge of neural architecture, comprehension of how attention, encoding, and consolidation interact to form lasting memory. She began formulating what she called the memory shield hypothesis. The idea that the valley's cognitive disruption wasn't a side effect or accident, but the primary purpose of the installation. Defensive architecture designed specifically to prevent sustained human observation. The hypothesis addressed several puzzles. Why would anyone build such a massive structure and then bury it? Why create something that remains functional for thousands of years with no apparent human interaction? The answer made sense if the structure itself wasn't meant to be accessed or used directly. If its purpose was simply to exist, to occupy a location, and to ensure that location couldn't be properly investigated or remembered. Grant identified 3 mechanisms working in concert. First, attention suppression. The valley environment actively discouraged detailed observation, generated a sense of ordinariness that made focused attention feel unnecessary. This prevented the initial encoding of detailed sensory information. Memories can't form if attention never focuses long enough to create detailed perception. Second, consolidation interference. The synchronized alpha wave patterns disrupted the process by which short-term memories transfer to long-term storage. Information entered working memory normally. People could think about what they were seeing in the moment, but the transfer to permanent memory failed. Like trying to save a file when the storage drive is disconnected. Third, retrieval disruption. Even memories that partially formed became difficult to access outside the influence zone. The neural pathways that encoded the memories, while under the influence of the field, couldn't be properly accessed once brain activity returned to normal. The memories existed in a state that was only accessible under the specific conditions that created them. Together, these mechanisms created multiple layers of defense. Even if someone managed to attend carefully and encode detailed observations despite the attention suppression, those observations would fail to consolidate into lasting memory. And even if consolidation partially succeeded, retrieval would fail once the person left the influence zone. The system was redundant, robust, designed to ensure that memory formation failed through multiple, independent mechanisms. But Grant's most significant insight was recognizing what this implied about the builder's knowledge. To create this system required understanding that human consciousness operates through specific neural mechanisms. That memory isn't a single process, but multiple stages. That attention, encoding, consolidation, and retrieval can be independently targeted. This level of knowledge about human neurobiology far exceeded what human science achieved until the late 20th century. Whoever built this understood human minds better than humans did, which suggested either they were human but possessed knowledge far in advance of known history, or they weren't human and had studied human cognition extensively. The memory shield hypothesis also explained why the installation remained active. It required minimal energy. The deep structure likely harvested geothermal energy from the Earth's heat, converting thermal differentials into electrical current, using that current to power the crystalline layer, creating a self-sustaining system that could operate indefinitely without maintenance. And because the memory shield prevented anyone who visited from retaining detailed memory of the visit, the installation could remain undiscovered despite being accessible on the surface. Grant published her findings in a specialized neuroscience journal. The paper generated interest within academic circles, but without the ability to replicate the conditions or study the site directly, the hypothesis remained speculative, intriguing theoretically, impossible to validate experimentally. She received one response that caught her attention, an email from a retired Air Force officer who'd worked in signals intelligence during the Cold War. He described similar effects experienced during a surveillance operation in Siberia in the 1980s, a remote location where equipment functioned normally, but operators consistently failed to retain detailed memories of what they'd observed. The operation was eventually abandoned, filed as equipment malfunction, but the retired officer had always suspected something else was happening. He provided coordinates. Grant compared them against the 17 candidate sites her team had identified. The Siberia location wasn't on the list, but when she examined available satellite imagery and historical survey data, it showed the same characteristics: sparse documentation, multiple surveys producing inconsistent descriptions, a place that resisted being properly remembered. This suggested the phenomenon wasn't limited to North America, possibly global, potentially dozens or hundreds of sites worldwide, all using the same technology, all creating the same memory disruption effect, all hiding in plain sight by preventing anyone from sustaining attention long enough to investigate thoroughly. Grant updated her hypothesis. What if these weren't isolated installations but a network? Coordinated sites serving a distributed purpose. Individual nodes in a system designed to create cognitive blind spots across the entire planet? But blind spots concealing what? What needed to be hidden so thoroughly? What justified building a global network of memory disruption fields that had operated continuously for thousands of years? The only answer that made sense was observational infrastructure. If something wanted to monitor Earth without being noticed, the most effective approach wouldn't be hiding physical presence. It would be preventing humans from forming lasting memories of that presence. People might see, might observe, might even photograph, but they wouldn't remember clearly, wouldn't process what they'd seen into lasting awareness, would dismiss their own experiences as mundane or unremarkable. This reframed the entire investigation. The valley wasn't the discovery. The valley was camouflage. The real discovery was whatever the memory shield was protecting, whatever existed in that location that required such sophisticated concealment. And if Grant's network hypothesis was correct, there were sites like this worldwide, potentially hundreds, each one hiding something, each one preventing humans from sustaining awareness of what was being hidden. The question became, was there a way to observe the valley without entering the influence zone? To investigate without subjecting human consciousness to the memory disruption field? Could the mystery be solved through indirect methods, remote sensing, autonomous systems, technologies that could gather information without requiring human memory formation? That question would eventually lead to discoveries far more troubling than the memory shield itself. Because observing the valley remotely revealed something the shield had successfully hidden from every human who'd entered it. Something that suggested the installation wasn't merely ancient, it was still in use, still serving its original purpose, still maintaining communication with something that had never stopped watching. Chapter 10. The Orbital Correlation. In 2015, advances in satellite technology enabled new forms of terrain analysis, high-resolution gravitational mapping, magnetometry from orbit, detection of subtle anomalies in Earth's magnetic and gravitational fields that indicated subsurface structures or unusual mass distributions. A research team at MIT, unaware of the valley investigation, was conducting a comprehensive gravitational survey of North America, mapping variations in local gravity across the continent, building datasets for geological modelling and resource exploration. During this survey, they detected an anomaly. A location in northeastern Nevada showed periodic gravitational microshifts. Variations far too small to affect anything functionally, but detectable with sensitive instruments. And the variations were periodic, repeating on a schedule. Every 17.3 hours, the local gravitational field showed a slight increase, lasting approximately 12 minutes, then returning to baseline. This pattern was impossible through known geological processes. Gravity variations occurred due to mass distribution changes, but subsurface mass doesn't shift on 17-hour cycles. The researchers flagged it as a data artifact, probable instrumental error or orbital position correlation, creating measurement variation. But when they cross-referenced the location, they found something interesting. The coordinates matched one of the candidate sites Grant's team had identified, the valley with the memory disruption field, the installation with the buried structure. They contacted Holbrook, shared their gravitational data, asked if there was any known reason for periodic mass variations at that location. Holbrook immediately recognized the significance. She requested the full data set, all measurements from that location, over the previous 2 years. The pattern was consistent. Every 17.3 hours, the gravitational signature changed. Not dramatically. Variations were less than 0.001% of baseline, but present, measurable, real. Holbrook consulted with physicists, asked what could cause periodic gravitational changes. The answers were limited: mass shifting position, extremely dense material being moved, or something more exotic, localized space-time curvature, gravitational effects from sources that weren't mass in the conventional sense. None of those explanations fit easily with the buried structure, unless the structure was doing something, operating, functioning, creating effects that propagated beyond the electromagnetic memory shield, effects that reached into orbit. Then Holbrook noticed something else. She cross-referenced the 17.3-hour cycle against satellite orbital periods, looking for correlations, checking if the gravitational shifts aligned with any orbital object. They did. Not with conventional satellites, but with something else, a classified object, one of several dozen unacknowledged orbital platforms maintained by the Department of Defense and National Reconnaissance Office, satellites that didn't officially exist, that serve surveillance and signals intelligence purposes, too sensitive for public acknowledgement. The correlation was precise. Every time this classified satellite passed over the valley, the gravitational anomaly occurred. The timing matched within seconds across 2 years of data. That couldn't be coincidence. Holbrook submitted a classified inquiry through official channels, requesting information about the satellite, asking if there was any known interaction between the platform and the surface location. The response was carefully worded. The satellite existed, but its functions were compartmented. Information sharing required specific authorization that wasn't being granted. But the response included one detail. The satellite's orbital parameters were unusual. It maintained position in what's called a pseudo-synchronous orbit, not truly geostationary, but repeating the same ground track every 17.3 hours, passing over the same surface locations on a regular schedule. And the valley was one of those locations. Every 17.3 hours, the satellite passed directly overhead, and every time it did, the buried structure responded. Generated a gravitational pulse, 12 minutes of measurable space-time curvature, then silence until the next pass. This suggested communication. The structure wasn't dormant, wasn't simply maintaining the memory shield. It was actively reporting, transmitting data upward, to the satellite, or through the satellite to something beyond. Holbrook expanded the investigation. She requested gravitational data for all 17 candidate sites, locations that showed similar characteristics to the valley. The MIT team provided what they had. Not all locations had sufficient coverage, but 9 of the 17 showed the same pattern. Periodic gravitational pulses, all synchronized to the same 17.3-hour cycle, all occurring when the classified satellite passed overhead. This was network confirmation. Multiple installations, all active, all communicating on the same schedule, all oriented towards something in orbit. A coordinated system spanning the continent, possibly spanning the planet. Grant updated her memory shield hypothesis. The shields weren't just concealing static installations, they were protecting active observational infrastructure. The buried structures were listening posts, gathering data, monitoring the surface, and reporting their findings upward at regular intervals. But reporting to what? The classified satellite was human-operated, launched from Earth, part of the terrestrial intelligence apparatus. It couldn't be the ultimate destination for data from installations thousands of years old. unless the satellite wasn't the destination, unless it was a relay, passing over the installations, receiving their data bursts, then transmitting them onward to something else, something not in low Earth orbit, something farther out, something that had been there long before humans began launching satellites and simply adapted to use the new infrastructure. This interpretation suggested something extraordinary. The installations had been built by non-human intelligence, had operated for thousands of years, had monitored human civilization throughout its development, and when humans finally achieved orbital capability, the system had incorporated that development, started using human satellites as communication relays, hiding data transmission inside legitimate satellite operations. It was the perfect camouflage strategy for an observational network. Don't build your own communication infrastructure that might be detected. Wait until the observed civilization builds its own. Then quietly piggyback on what they've created. Hide your signals among their signals. Become invisible within their own technology. Holbrook submitted a detailed report to the Department of Defense, laying out the evidence, the buried structures, the memory shields, the periodic gravitational pulses, the satellite correlation, the implication that Earth was under systematic observation by non-human intelligence using technology far beyond current human capability. The response was bureaucratic deflection. The satellite's functions remained classified. No comment on potential signal interception or relay. The investigation was outside DoD's area of responsibility, suggested referral to NASA or the NSA. But something did change. Within weeks, the classified satellite's orbital parameters shifted. The 17.3-hour cycle altered. The satellite no longer passed directly over the valley on a regular schedule, and the gravitational pulses stopped. Whatever communication had been occurring, it ceased, or moved to a different frequency, or shifted to a different relay system. The DoD's response suggested they'd either known about this all along and were managing it quietly, or they'd just learned about it and had immediately taken action to disrupt the communication. Either way, the official response was to make the investigation disappear, classify everything, restrict access, prevent further public discussion. Holbrook's research project lost its remaining funding. Files were transferred to classified archives. The team was asked to sign non-disclosure agreements, not prohibited from discussing their work, but strongly encouraged to avoid doing so. The implication was clear. This matter was now handled through channels that didn't include academic research or public knowledge. The valley returned to obscurity, still on maps, still accessible, still protected by its memory shield, and still presumably transmitting data, just not through the channel that had been discovered. Whatever intelligence maintained the installations had adapted, modified its communication strategy, continued operating beneath human awareness. The investigation had revealed the system, but revealing it didn't disable it. The memory shield continued to prevent sustained human attention. The buried structure continued to function. The observation continued. We'd simply lost the ability to monitor the monitoring, to know what was being watched and what was being reported. That remains the situation today. The valley exists, the installations exist, the network exists. Somewhere overhead, something receives their transmissions, processes their data, maintains observation of a planet whose inhabitants mostly don't realize they're being watched. Because that's the genius of the memory shield. Even people who learn about it struggle to maintain concern. The effective flattening extends beyond direct exposure. Just knowing about the installations doesn't generate the emotional engagement necessary to sustain investigation. The phenomenon exists in a cognitive blind spot, important enough to briefly capture attention, not emotionally salient enough to hold it. We forget, not because we want to, not because we decide to, but because the system was designed to ensure we would forget. Designed by intelligence that understood human psychology better than we understand it ourselves. Chapter 11. The Failed Return Visit. 3 years after the classified satellite's orbital parameters shifted, Holbrook decided to return to the valley. Alone this time, without official authorization or institutional support. She wanted to verify that the installation was still operational. Wanted to experience the memory shield again. Wanted to confirm that everything they documented was real and not some shared delusion or misinterpreted data. She didn't tell anyone where she was going, filed no expedition report, took minimal equipment, just GPS, a camera, and a voice recorder for documentation. This would be personal verification, unofficial observation. If the memory shield was still active, she'd experience its effects directly. If it had somehow deactivated, she'd be able to explore without cognitive interference. She drove to the valley perimeter in mid-afternoon. The access road was unchanged, still degraded, still minimally maintained. No evidence that anyone had been there since the last official visit. She parked where the road descended into the basin and prepared to enter on foot. GPS showed the coordinates clearly. Valley entrance approximately half a mile ahead. Direct path, easy terrain. She started walking. What happened over the next 2 hours remains unclear. Holbrook's GPS log shows her position moving into the valley, following the expected route, advancing toward the centre where base camp had been established during previous expeditions. But her voice recorder contains only fragments, disconnected observations, long periods of silence. At timestamp 43 minutes, her voice. The terrain looks different than I remember, more eroded, or maybe that's the memory distortion. Hard to tell what's real and what's reconstructed recollection. Silence for 18 minutes. At timestamp 61 minutes. I should be able to see the survey markers from the 2008 expedition. They should be visible from this position, but I don't see them. Either they've been removed, or I'm not where I think I am. Silence for 22 minutes. At timestamp 83 minutes. This doesn't feel right. Something about the landscape. It's I can't explain it, too normal, too aggressively average, like it's trying to convince me there's nothing here, which means there is something here. The shield is working exactly as we documented. Silence for 37 minutes. The next voice entry is at timestamp 120 minutes. I'm leaving. I don't know why I came here. This was pointless. There's nothing to see, nothing to document. I should go home. The GPS log shows her position at that moment was approximately 60 yards from where the buried structure's crystalline layer was most active. She'd reached the centre of the influence zone, and instead of investigating, she turned around and started walking out. In the recording, her voice sounds calm, rational, but the decision makes no sense. She'd driven hours to reach the valley specifically to investigate. She'd reached the most significant location, and instead of exploring, she simply left. As if her purpose for being there had been erased, as if the motivation that brought her had been retroactively deleted from her consciousness. The GPS track shows her exiting the valley along a different path than she'd entered. Not dramatically different, but curved, circuitous, as if her navigation was being subtly disrupted, guided away from the centre without her realising it. She reached her vehicle at timestamp 149 minutes, 2.5 hours in the valley, and according to her own voice recording, she decided within those 2.5 hours that the entire trip was pointless. Nothing to see, nothing to investigate, time to leave. Holbrook has no clear memory of making that decision. When she reviewed the recording later, she couldn't explain her reasoning. Why had she left? Why had she concluded there was nothing to investigate? She'd specifically gone there knowing the memory shield would affect her, expecting cognitive interference. She should have been prepared to resist it, but preparation didn't matter. Conscious awareness of the effect didn't prevent it. The shield operated on processes below voluntary control. You couldn't decide not to be affected any more than you could decide not to be influenced by gravity. The mechanism worked whether you knew about it or not. What troubles Holbrook most is the gap in the recording. 37 minutes of silence while she was at the valley centre. She has no memory of what happened during that time, no recollection of what she saw or did. The GPS shows her position remaining relatively stationary, moving in a small area, as if exploring something, or being shown something. Then the memory ends, replaced by the conviction that she needed to leave. She's considered returning with video equipment, continuous recording that would capture whatever happened during those missing minutes. But she recognises the problem. Even with video evidence, her memory of reviewing it would be affected. The shield doesn't just prevent memory formation in real time, it makes memory of the location difficult to sustain even afterward. This is perhaps the shield's most sophisticated feature. It doesn't just protect the installation from discovery while people are present, it protects it from sustained investigation afterward. Even documentation becomes hard to engage with seriously. Reading reports about the valley produces the same affective flattening, the same sense that this isn't important. That attention should be directed elsewhere. Grant's memory shield hypothesis predicted this. The shield creates a cognitive hazard zone, not just geographically, but conceptually. The installation becomes difficult to think about, difficult to care about, even for people who've studied it extensively. The emotional salience necessary to maintain long-term investigation gradually erodes, until the subject fades from active consideration. This report is itself evidence of the effect. How many times did writing it feel unnecessary? How many times did the thought arise that this story isn't important? That attention should focus on more pressing matters? That impulse isn't natural editorial judgment. It's the shield's influence extending through documentation and analysis. Because that's what the shield does. It makes everything associated with the installation feel unimportant, not worth sustained effort, not worth emotional investment, until eventually people stop investigating, stop asking questions, stop caring, and the installation returns to its preferred state, known but not examined, documented but not understood, existing in the blind spot between awareness and attention. Epilogue, the coordinates that feel empty. The valley still exists. Its coordinates remain in official databases. 39.83 degrees north, 117.11 degrees west. You can find it on maps. Satellite imagery shows it clearly. Rock formations, desert scrub, seasonal drainage patterns, an entirely ordinary piece of landscape in northeastern Nevada. Multiple expeditions have documented its existence, geological surveys, subsurface scans, photographic evidence. The installation beneath it has been measured, mapped, analysed. Core samples sit in laboratories. Data exists in multiple archives. The facts are not in dispute, yet almost no one investigates. Few people find it interesting enough to warrant attention. Even among those who know about the memory shield, the effective response is muted. Yes, there's probably something significant there. Yes, it might represent non-human intelligence. Yes, it could be evidence of ongoing observation. But somehow, those facts don't generate the urgency or concern they should. That's the success of the memory shield, not that it prevents discovery. Discovery has already occurred, multiple times, by multiple independent teams. The shield's success is that discovery doesn't lead to sustained investigation, doesn't produce the emotional engagement necessary for thorough understanding. People find out, document their findings, and then gradually stop caring. This might be happening worldwide. The 17 candidate sites in North America, the location in Siberia, potentially hundreds more, all protected by the same technology, all hiding in plain sight, all defended by cognitive interference rather than physical barriers. What are they monitoring? What data do they collect? The installations predate human civilization. They've watched us develop from scattered tribes to global technological society. They've observed everything and reported it to something that has maintained interest in Earth for thousands of years. The most unsettling possibility is that we're not discovering these installations. We're being allowed to discover them. The shield prevents sustained attention, but it doesn't prevent initial finding. Maybe that's intentional. Maybe whatever built these sites wants us to know they exist, wants us to understand we're being watched, but doesn't want us to sustain enough focus to actually do anything about it. It's a perfect control mechanism. Awareness without agency, knowledge without power. We know we're observed, we know there are installations, we know they communicate with something, but the knowledge sits inert, generating no action, producing no response, because the emotional weight necessary to drive action has been stripped away by the same system we're trying to investigate. If this interpretation is correct, then the memory shield isn't just defensive technology, it's also psychological manipulation, ensuring that even when humans discover the observation network, they can't sustain enough concern to interfere with it, can't maintain the focus necessary to disable it, can't generate the emotional engagement required to actually do something about being watched. And it works. This report exists. The information is compiled. The evidence is presented. But how many readers will finish and then immediately think about something else? How many will acknowledge the implications intellectually but feel no emotional urgency? How many will know about the valley but never feel compelled to visit it? That's the shield functioning, even through text, even through documented analysis. The cognitive interference extends beyond direct exposure. Simply engaging with information about the installation gradually produces the same affective flattening, the same erosion of concern, until the whole subject feels distant, abstract, not worth sustained thought. Maybe that's what alien intelligence looks like. Not flying saucers, not dramatic encounters, just systematic cognitive manipulation, making yourself unrememberable, uninteresting, defended not by violence but by selective attention disruption, hiding not from our eyes but from our ability to care about what our eyes have seen. The valley is still there, the installation is still active, but the observation continues, and somewhere overhead something receives the data, processes the information, maintains watch over a species that knows it's being watched but can't quite bring itself to care enough to do anything about it. The coordinates exist: 39.83 north, 117.11 west. They're not secret. Anyone can find them. Anyone can go there, but almost no one does, because that's how the shield works. Not by hiding the location, but by making everyone who knows about it gradually forget why they cared in the first place. And if you're reading this and thinking, that's interesting, I should learn more, pay attention to how long that feeling lasts. Pay attention to when the thought occurs that, actually, this isn't that important, that there are more pressing concerns, that this can be looked into later, that later never comes. That's the shield. That's the defense. That's how something can hide in plain sight for thousands of years. By making itself feel empty, unimportant, not worth your time. Even now reading this, can you feel it? The slow erosion of concern, the gradual sense that this doesn't really matter, that you should be thinking about something else. That's not your judgment. That's the system working, extending its influence through every description of it, making even the act of learning about it feel unnecessary. The valley that couldn't be remembered has ensured that even when remembered, it still can't be sustained in focused attention, still can't generate the emotional weight necessary for action, still exists in the blind spots between knowledge and caring, and it will continue to exist there. As long as the shield functions, as long as the installations operate, as long as something overhead wants to watch without being watched in return. The coordinates are there, the evidence is documented, the truth is accessible. But the shield ensures that truth feels empty, hollow, not worth the effort of genuine investigation. And so the observation continues, the monitoring persists, the data flows upward, to something that has perfected the art of hiding, not from our perception, but from our priorities. Because in the end, what's the difference between being completely hidden and being known but not cared about? Either way, you remain undisturbed. Either way, your work continues. Either way, you watch a species that knows it's being watched but can never quite remember why that should matter.